The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. 2 people went up to the temple area to pray. One was the Pharisees and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisees took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income. But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat at his breast and prayed, O God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
2 people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee. The other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. I don't know whether you caught that in the Gospel, but the exact translation in the Gospel of Luke literally says he stood and prayed with himself. Not to God, not with God, just to himself. Now, if you remember last week, our gospel reminded us about the importance of prayer, perseverance in prayer, and to pray always. In my homily, I talked about that because we certainly are living in a time where very few people, and not all, but very few people pray always. In other words, praying every day. For many people, it's a hit and miss kind of a thing. Some days I pray, some days I don't. So therefore, I never establish in my soul the virtue of prayer itself. And as long as I have a hit and miss kind of expression of a prayer life, I will never find joy in prayer. It'll always be hard. It'll always be difficult. Because I will always have to fight against myself to take that time to pray, to be with God, because the world is always sucking me away from God. And I use all the excuses in the world to justify my busyness and my carelessness. But never more have we needed human beings today than people who pray. Without prayer, we can't save our souls. And I don't mean hit and miss prayer, but I mean praying every day. To have a prayer life, that's what it's called. Once that prayer life is established in the human soul, it becomes a part of my being. It becomes a part of who I am. And I remember for the first 2 years, and I'm not going to spend too much time on today because I talked about it last week, but just as a little refresher for those who weren't here, I remember as I forced myself to pray every day, no matter how difficult it was, no matter how busy I thought I was, I always made sure I said my prayers every day. Went to Mass every day. And I noticed all of a sudden, after about 2 years, that prayer became easier. I no longer had to struggle against myself. I no longer had to fight with the busyness of the world and the things I had to do. Prayer now felt to me as a way of life. Prayer nourished me. I could feel the way it changed me. And as life went on, prayer became easier, and I began to find joy in the prayer life. And I learned to understand from the writings of the great spiritual writers and the saints that without prayer, you cannot save your soul. And you need to have a prayer life. And I don't mean hit and miss. It's got to be there every day, no matter how hard it might be, we have to do it. There comes a time where it gets easier. If you ever wonder why you're never changing, why you're never growing in holiness, it's because we don't pray. It's not all that complicated because in prayer comes the virtues to the human soul. They're not automatically poured into our lap. We have to pray. And even I noticed, the more I prayed, the more my interior, my soul, the way I looked at things began to change. I no longer looked at the way I used to when I was younger or didn't pray. Now I had a completely different perspective interiorly. So last week we talked a little bit about that, about having a prayer life, the importance of having a prayer life and a spiritual life. Without a prayer life, you have no spiritual life. You can't grow in holiness. There are 7 different kinds of prayers. How many of us even know the first one? Vocal prayer. Most of us don't even know how to do that. The second one is meditation. Most of us don't even do that because our brains are all over the place. They're occupied with 1,000 different things. Emotionally, I'm thinking about this, I'm struggling with that, I got to do this, and so on and so on. So my mind never sits still before God. So I never really pray, so I just pray with myself. As a Pharisee has done today in our reading. Because I'm so distracted that God is not a part of my prayer. And we've all done it, and I've done it too. You can pray a decade of the rosary and you start with a Hail Mary, you end with the 10th one, and you say to yourself, wow, what happened? I thought about 1,000 different things while I was praying. I didn't place myself in the presence of God. I didn't make an effort to still my mind. But in the end, I tell myself, well, at least I'm doing it. And that's not the point. Yes, we have to do it. But we have to make an effort to do it better. Without that vocal prayer and that meditation, there is no contemplation. There is no mystical union. None of the other prayer levels don't even come to us. And we are called to experience these prayer levels in our lives. We see it in the lives of the saints. For many people, God is outside. He's up there somewhere with a big microphone. He hears. But God is found inside. Teresa of Avila wrote about the 7 Teresa mansions, which is 7 levels of prayer, a journey deep inside the soul where God is found. It isn't all that hard to understand if you think about the fact that we receive all of our sacraments as an experience interiorly. Even though it's done externally, there's something that takes place inside. When we receive communion, God reveals himself to us in the depths of our souls, but we're not even aware of it because we don't have a prayer life. We don't talk to God enough. We talk to everybody else, but we don't talk to God. So without the prayer life, we can't grow in holiness. Now, having said that, let's talk a little bit about these 2 men today. As last week, of course, to pray always, to persevere in prayer. Today, the gospel gives us a way to pray and a way not to pray. The Pharisee is the person how not to pray. And the publican, the tax collector, is the way we should come to God. You don't have to tell God how good you are, like the Pharisee did. But to be like the tax collector, to humbly bow before God and say, Lord, have mercy on me, I am a sinner. Did we come in the presence of God when we came to church today and acknowledged our sinfulness? We're all sinners. Or did we absolutely pay no attention to God? Did we prepare ourselves in the car to speak with God? To be present to God? to allow him to come into my being and make myself present to him. It's part of the gift of our Catholic faith, you see. But we forget. We're not like any other religion on the face of the earth. We have the unique mystery of receiving God. So it makes us Catholic. It's been that way for 2,000 years. But I want to talk a little bit about the Pharisee today, because he's very distasteful in reality. He's like those souls that like to point the finger at everybody else. Oh boy, I'm glad I'm not like that person. We've all done it. We're all guilty. Look at that individual. Look at the way they live their lives. They're not even married. Look, so on and so on. We always know the weaknesses of others, but we don't know our own weaknesses. That's the problem. The Pharisee literally patted himself on the back and said to God, "You need people like me. Look at me. I go to the temple, I keep the feast days, and I take care of the poor, and so on and so on." But why is it that in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, the entire chapter is dedicated to the condemnation of the Pharisees? It contains 8 woes, which he utters against them. He calls them many unflattering names, and after each woe, he calls them hypocrites. You know what a hypocrite is? Somebody with 2 faces, right? They look pious in church, but don't meet them out in the street, because it might not be the same pious person you just saw at Mass. Hypocrites, he calls them, and many other unflattering names. One of them certainly was white sepulchres, appearing to be beautiful to men on the outside, but full of dead man bones, and all uncleanliness within. Such harshness from Christ may be a little hard to swallow. But he spoke to them because they were stuck in a sin of pride. It was ingrained in the very depths of their hearts. Faith is not a gift of the proud. It's only a gift of the humble. But who are the Pharisees? We hear the names mentioned. If you ask anybody to tell you who the Pharisees are, most people can't tell you anything about the Pharisees. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson, so you'll have a better understanding who these people are. They're not lawyers. They're theologians. They're sort of kind of self-made theologians. God didn't appoint the Pharisees to anything. He didn't even make Pharisees. They came into existence about 2 centuries before Christ. And the word itself, which is Aramaic, means separated ones. They separated themselves from an oath of allegiance to Herod the Great. They practiced a passive resistance, but avoided embroilment in political affairs. They maintained a similar attitude towards the Roman authorities. But however, they also separated themselves from the people of the land, a mass of people whom they called ignoramus, ignorant, who knew not the law. Because you see, they were the theologians. They knew the law. Nobody else knew the law, but they knew it. And they would have people locked up if they didn't follow the law. They would go into towns. There was roughly, we believe, according to history and the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, he tells us there was a number of about 6,000 in the time of Christ. And it was spread all over the land. And if people were not living the precepts of the law, they would be arrested. If they were asked by a Pharisee what the laws were and they couldn't answer them, they were arrested. The Pharisees were a tough nut to crack. They were hard-headed, in other words. This is why Christ is always at odds with them. And he literally, in his woes and calling them hypocrites, condemns them. There's no eternal salvation for the proud. Because part of the problem here is they set themselves apart from the people, made themselves better. Yes, they had a detailed knowledge of the Mosaic law and tradition of the elders, but they interpreted the Torah according to their own oral mentality. And they made the insistence on the oral tradition the most important thing, and this was the weakness of being a Pharisee. They offered a means of adopting the law of God to changing circumstances, whatever comes up. Whatever the political system was at that time, that's the way the wind blew, that's the way it went. And they always stuck to their guns. They would often ask the people who did not know the law, who had to live by 613 precepts. God never gave 613 precepts to live by. He gave a law. He gave the 10 Commandments, yes. He also prescribed for them how they would celebrate their feast days, especially the 3 major feast days of the year, that everyone who could make it should go to Jerusalem, celebrate the feast day in Jerusalem if they can make it. But they changed the law into things that it was so difficult to live that most people could not live it, and the Pharisees did nothing to help anybody to live or to understand it even. It became confusing. It also meant that the Pharisees were more open to the acceptance of new ideas, and this is, of course, what got them into trouble. While stressing the action of divine providence, they also insisted on the human freedom of interpreting God's law. How many people have done that throughout Christian history? How many people do it today? How many people leave the Catholic Church because they want to interpret Christianity according to their own understanding? Not according to truth, because it's too hard. Preoccupation with the oral prescriptions set them at odds with the written law. It led to legalism, false interpretations of the laws revealed by God. In other words, the Pharisees were filled with pride. Pride is a horrible sin. We all have it. We have it deeply ingrained in our soul. Every sin that the human being commits at whatever level it might be has some form of pride involved in it. No one can say, I don't have any pride, because we all have it. St. Thomas Aquinas said in his writings that pride dies 6 months after we're buried. So that goes to show you how long it holds on. Even the saints will tell you how difficult it is to be humble and to overcome one's pride. The word humility today, you tell Christians, we got to practice being humble. Oh my God, they don't want to hear that because they think it means being stepped on. No, it doesn't. To be humble means to be like Christ, to be meek and humble of heart, to be able to accept what other people throw at us without getting angry, without getting frustrated, and so on and so on. But pride was the first sin committed. It was a sin, of course, committed by the Pharisee in today's reading. It was also the sin of Lucifer. It is the root of the original sin committed by Adam and Eve. Pride is the greatest of sins because it is the summit of self-love and is directly opposed to submission to God. It is therefore the sin most hated by God and the one he punishes most severely. We're living in a time today when Catholics like to pick and choose. We've all heard of that. Oh, yeah, I accept this, but I don't want to accept that. I don't believe the church. No, I don't, I don't have to go to church. Where does it say I got to go to confession? Where does it say I got to go to church on Sundays, and so on and so on? We like to pick and choose. And that's pride. That's pride operating in the human soul. But it is the sin most hated by God and the one he punishes most severely. The punishment of the angels of Adam and Eve, Nebuchadnezzar, is related in the book of Daniel, which bears witness to it. Pride is likewise the greatest sin because it is a fountainhead of self-love, in which all other sins take root. Self-love. From pride, all addition takes its beginnings. There's a species of pride in every sin, like I just said. Pride is the most dangerous of sin because it blinds our understanding. And unless something finally makes us realize the truth, we're liable to go on day after day, full of spiritual self-delusions, imagining our acts to be good and virtuous when certain habits actually may be even vicious. We justify our behaviors towards others. When we are blinded by pride, we do not consider our talents and our abilities as God's gift to us, but attribute these good qualities to ourselves with the right to use them as we see fit. How true is that in the modern world today, huh? We have a shortage of priests. Should we have a shortage of priests? No. God never stopped calling. Men stopped answering. Convents are losing their vocations, not because God stopped calling women. Women stopped answering God. That's pride. Spiritual self-delusion. And we don't normally ask God, what do you want from me? You know, Lord, what? Because when God creates us, He has a plan for our lives. If we're not praying, we will never discover that plan. Everybody's infected with this virus, but there's a particular kind of pride in each individual, at least a particular kind that dominates, even though we may have several of its viruses in the same character. This pride is determined in our temperament or the type of our character. Searching into that type of pride is very important for us to have true knowledge of ourselves. And I know it's hard sometimes to swallow that and to say to oneself, yeah, that fits me. As I'm going to go through these temperaments, there's 4 of them. Just listen. Take a moment and stop looking at everybody else and stop pointing at everybody else and say, yeah, I know a person that has that pride. Don't. Look at yourself and say, yes, Lord, that's me. I need to work on that. And then make an effort to overcome it. If we have a sanguine temperament, our pride takes the form of self-centeredness. We want to be the hub of the wheel. We want others to notice us. We are touchy and easily offended. Our pride goes us to seek fame, praise, and admiration. We fall into vainglory. These are the people who walk by a glass or a mirror, who need to look at themselves and comb their hair and fix their clothes or whatever. Vainglory. If we have a choleric temperament, our pride is manifested in a strong self-will. We find it hard to submit to others or to yield to their opinions. People will have arguments about opinions, and I've often tell people, don't. It's one thing to have a discussion about the truth, because the truth is absolute. But don't argue about an opinion, because everyone has a right to have an opinion. And we have no right to start yelling and tearing other people to pieces because of their opinion. But we do it all the time. We downgrade people, we yell at them, we curse at them, and so on, because of their opinion, to which they have a right. This soul can often be overbearing, critical. And one of the most difficult types of souls to hang around is a soul that is always critical, given into arguing. Because a soul that is critical is a soul that is full of acid and vinegar. They're sour. They're always complaining about something. They always have a negative attitude about everything. They have an inflated sense of superiority, inconsiderate of the rights of others. How many times have we fallen into that? If we are melancholy, our pride conceals itself under the garb of self-pity and oversensitiveness. Resentment comes with this one. Holding on and harboring grudges. I don't want to forgive. I don't want to let go. They did me wrong, so therefore, that's pride. That is pride. You can have all the excuses in the world why you want to justify not forgiving. But in the end, it's pride. And God does not like pride. People who have this particular sin also have suspicion. Unexpressed hostility towards someone is included in it. Often this pride is not recognized for what it is because it conceals itself in such a way that we do not even confess it as pride. And I'll tell you a little truth. I've been a priest for many, 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 many years. I remember in all those years, probably one time, did somebody come to me and confess being proud. It goes to show how much hidden that sin is in all of us. We have it. We can't deny it. We all have it, to some degree or another. But people who go to confession never confess pride. They confess all the other things, but pride is never acknowledged. So I would encourage you, when you go to confession, make it your first sin. Father, I'm a proud human being. I'm guilty. I need to work on overcoming that. If we have the phlegmatic character, our pride inclines us to self-complacency and vanity. We are likely to be shocked by faults in others. This is the one person that always knows how to find a fault in everybody else. Look at that person, so on and so on. But yet they are quite satisfied with their own weaknesses, their own cursing, their anger, their drinking, their swearing, whatever it might be. They're quite happy with controlling others and so on and so on. And they couldn't care less about trying to make themselves better. These are the four kinds of temperaments. And remember that pride has many facets. And we don't have time to get into all the facets. Maybe I'll do it at the 10:30 Mass.